The next speaker is here in person. It's Sveinn Agnarsson from University of Iceland. And he's a professor at the School of Business in Iceland and holds a PhD in economics. And his research has focused mostly on fisheries economics, and he's been involved in marine-related international projects, for example. So thanks for joining us from Iceland today. This microphone, and you have the pointer here to get your slides further. Yes.
Is this live? Okay, good. So thank you, and good to be with you here in person. I should also say that in this project I represent Sjókovin, which is a not-for-profit institute or a research agency in the Faroe Islands. So as they were involved in this project and directly, and not the University of Iceland. So I sometimes have on a little Faroese hat. But you can see the countries involved in red on the map. So there were several of us in Europe taking part in this project, ranging all the way from the north to the south. So hopefully I can get this going. Yes. So the objectives that we had in this project, of course, were to demonstrate suitability and economic viability of new proteins. We were focusing on microalgae, insects, and single cells, and in an industrial environment, and of course with the aim to either complement more traditional sources or replace them, and of course the main idea also to strengthen food security in Europe and sustainability and self-sufficiency of the European protein production. So let me just push this. So we had, like I said, you can see here on the screen, it's a very small letters, I'm afraid. But we're using underutilized resources. We used CO2 for the algae in Iceland. We used pre-consumer food waste for the insects, and we used food carbohydrate from the woods as for the forest biomass for the single cell proteins, where we're using torula. And of course, this was all done. You can see it, I think, a little better on this slide, which shows you first the producers we had, 4 producers, 1 producing algae, 1 producing single cells, 2 producing insects. And then we were focusing on the production, on the characterization, optimization, and then we had a number of food industry partners where we were looking at food applications and product development, both for food and for feed. And also in between, we were doing things like environmental and economic impact assessment and looking at the risk involved. And then the final part of our project consisted of looking at the market side, the consumer acceptance and the market for the products that we were producing. So we were not focusing as much on safety as perhaps in the previous project that was being introduced here today. So let's look at the main results we had. We had production and optimization, 12 tons of proteins produced. We had scales up, incredible scale up in some of the SMEs that were taking part in the project. And we had application in food products. We had development, like I said. We were testing storage and consumers and the acceptability among consumers. We ended up having 2 products which will probably be sold in the market, 1 in Iceland and 1 in Sweden. We also were looking at the feed possibilities, application in feed, both for broilers in Turkey and in aquaculture. And very promising, but I will look at the challenges a little later on. There is no product there which is being marketed as such. We were also looking very much into the consumer side, and we were doing surveys in many countries, totaling 6,600 consumers. In general, consumers were very positive and open, but sometimes they did not really know what to think. And there are challenges to get consumers to accept protein ingredients from insects, like crickets, for instance. We had crickets and we had black soldier fly. They do accept the product, provided taste is similar, and they can trust that they are not being misled. And they do, of course, expect that these products are sustainable and that we respect animal and human health. They are more willing to accept alternative proteins in feed, but they're quite hesitant when it comes to food. And that is not something that surprised us very much. Yeah. So the challenges we faced. First of all, it was the COVID-19 period. Our project, like all these projects, these four that started in the wave in 2019, had the opening kickoff meeting in October, I think, in 2019. And then we didn't see each other until at the end in October 2022. So a long time passed without us meeting. We had to make do with online meetings, and it did hamper us. But we did not extend the project, and it is being completed now on time. So that was a bit difficult. But what else? We did a risk analysis, and we were looking at the value chain of the proteins, and we were asking, okay, what is the problems in each step of the production, all the way from beginning right to the end. And in addition, we asked some other questions more general. One of the things that came up again and again in our conversations, not just with people inside the project, but we also interviewed people outside the project, was funding. Accessibility to funds, not necessarily in the very beginning, but in the next step, when you have secured funding for the first part and you want to continue. And that was a real difficulty. Such a difficulty did we indeed encounter in our project, because one of the 4 protein producers that was taking part in the project in the beginning went bankrupt. So it does not exist anymore. They were producing crickets in Finland. There was also problems for the insect feeders of accessing feed at the right price, the right quality, the right quantity. Sometimes also getting availability of inputs that might qualify as sustainable, like for instance energy, electricity, for instance. No organic certification for insects exists at the moment. And for those for the 3 producers that remained in the project, 2 of them regarded the scale-up possibilities very limited. You could, of course, increase the quantity of, for instance, insects produced by having more production facilities. And another one possibly had some scale-up possibilities. On the regulatory side, well, we overcame all the challenges we faced there. There was no request for novel food authorization in our project. But everyone that we talked to talked about these general challenges, the improving the balance between regulation and innovation within Europe, strengthening financial incentives and support, not least for firms that are engaged, small firms which are pushing for EFSA authorization, develop a top-down approach whereby the authorities would determine which proteins should be emphasized, what production should be emphasized, and then laying down the law regarding quality and how you should go about producing those proteins. It would not exclude, of course, the present situation where firms do it themselves directly and there is a bottom-up approach, but it might help. Structure a more comprehensive policy together with the farm-to-fork policies and other policies the European Union has in place. Speed up authorization of novel food, like we said before, and then globally harmonize regulation all over the world, because one can regard the regulation system in Europe as a trade barrier. The challenge is when we were looking at the products. The feed problem was that they liked the feed, but it was just too expensive. And it was not being produced in enough quantity because they are small producers. So they was produced in batches, mostly for trials. And if you have big aquaculture farms that need a lot of feed, then that is not going to be good enough. The products for food, there were problems there we had sometimes with smell, with taste, with texture, with color. Many of these were overcome, but it was difficult in cases to mask this. And of course, consumers they know what they have, and they want the alternative to be close to what they have. And that can be difficult. What we hope we could do is somehow boost consumer acceptance. This is a major challenge for many protein producers. We need to provide information on toxicology, microbiological and chemical safety, nutritional value, sustainability, quality. And stakeholders all through the chain can collaborate to provide this robust scientific information. But at the same time, we need the authorities to guide consumer choices. We need possibly some kind of interventions and nudging, help bridge the gap between alternative proteins and other. I was at a meeting last week and they were talking about why do we always call this alternative proteins? I mean, that makes it look like meat is the real thing and we are producing something that is not quite as good, but is an alternative. Why don't we simply drop this alternative? But that's another story. We can think about that later. And then, of course, we have to make these sustainable options more affordable. And that there are various incentives and tax policies that could be implemented. Looking at the consumers and markets more, we need to somehow try to change the value proposition of firms. Not just the price. It is not just the price of a protein that we are offering. We are offering something more, quality, functionality. There's a lot of health claims, sustainability issues that we need to bring to the table and get people to focus more on than just the price. There is one partner raised the possibility of carbon credit transactions, so you could transfer the credits, the carbon credits from producing these to other industries, possibly. As a part of the project, we did a futuristic, or rather future projection of what could happen. We did kind of a scenario building. We had 3 scenarios. One, which is pretty much business as usual, where you have the food sector dominated by the policies of today and the big partners in the food industry. And it is very difficult if you expect that to continue as it is for alternative protein producers or products to break into the market. But if we get a more, if we might call it a slight paradigm shift towards greater how shall I say it, to get people to be thinking more about sustainability, then of course we would believe that some of the proteins in our projects at least could enter the general larger market. And of course, in a case where we have a shortage of food, which we already have in many places throughout the world, then I suppose people would accept anything that they could get their hands on. And in that case, of course, alternative proteins would be in a completely different position. And we also need to be aware of the fact that in a world like this, these are innovative firms, and not all innovative firms survive. And that is something we really have to think about. So what is the critical role of these alternative proteins in shaping the future of our food systems? Well, we know they have a smaller environmental impact than others. They are part in meeting this increased protein demand. They have a huge market potential, but they need help from others. There is this transition challenge ahead of us, and we have to be aware that good things, they happen slowly. I mean, this transition is not going to take place in a few years. This is an ongoing shift, and it may take decades for it to sort of run its course. We have to think about affordability, that they must be competitive, and when timing, because the key thing here as we see it is that it's on the demand side. Demand must be ready for these new proteins, because if you put into the market products, no matter how good they are, if the timing is wrong, they will not be a market success. So that is something to think of. So how would you go about doing that? We have to educate consumer. We must encourage collaboration between partners. We must invest in research and development. And we must change the regulations to allow these new proteins to get a stronger presence in the market. And that, I think, is what the impact of this project is, to sort of showing that the proteins that we were developing in our project, they can contribute to this transition. I think I have come to the end of my time. The other impact I would mention, of course, is the Horizon for Proteins. There we have the 4 original partners, but of course 3 more joined this year. And I'll leave you with wishing you all an alternative protein-rich future. Thank you.
Are there any questions for Sveinn?
Good morning. Do you think that the alternative proteins will impact on the already existing protein sources in the same way transversally, or will impact in some sectors more and in some sector less? For example, in considering the amount, on the price, or the time of obtaining the actual proteins. Thank you. And sorry, second, and thank you very much for the picture before from Bologna rice cake. I'm from Bologna. Yes. Okay, thank you. I've realized this.
We were there in October. Very lovely meeting we had there with our partners. I think that the question of who is going to produce these proteins and in which sector of the economy is a little bit unclear, because if you want them to break into the larger markets, you need to have a kind of a shift. Now, we have in Europe, for instance, the Common Agricultural Policy, and we have the Farm to Fork Policy. We are looking for a protein strategy that will hopefully be developed next year. So we have these instruments there. But currently, for instance, the Common Agricultural Policy is very much geared towards traditional agricultural products. Now, do we expect those farmers that are engaged currently in that to shift to alternative proteins? They could, but they would need massive investments, because they might experience loss of income. There might be a need for investment in agriculture, in know-how, in finding new markets. So it's not going to be easy for that particular group of producers who are currently producing protein of other form to shift into this. If we are going to do that, then of course we would have to restructure a little bit of our support systems. If we, on the other hand, and this is of course where the large market is, so if we don't go that way, then somehow we have to make it possible for small, medium-sized firms that are producing proteins to break into the general market, so to say, from another direction, like an emerging market and a niche market. And you don't want them. A niche market is like a word meaning that you're stuck there for ages. So somehow you have to lift them out of that position. And that you have to do, on the one hand, through supports by leveling the playing field as regards to incentives and taxes in the food market, and on the one hand, and encouraging support for firms that are engaged in research and development, but also very much so on the consumer side. And I think the consumer side is something that we really have to think a lot about, because unless we get consumers to accept these new proteins and the idea of eating these proteins, we will never be able to break through in the market. So I think that is a very, very important issue. I hope I have somehow answered your question.
Yeah, thank you very much for the nice presentation. You mentioned during the presentation that there were trials on broilers and turkeys.
Yeah.
Yeah. You said you were going to show some results later, and yeah, I could not see.
No, I was not going to show these results.
Okay.
No, I was not thinking about that.
Okay.
Those are technical issues.
Okay. Has there been any trials in the area of pigs or ruminant animals?
There were animals. Let me see now. There were broilers. I don't recall pigs. No, I don't recall pigs. But I think they have a license. They are allowed to use some of these proteins for feed for pigs. But I don't think they had pigs.
Okay. What about for ruminant animals?
We had broilers and we had aquaculture, I think.
Okay.
I may be wrong, but I'm pretty certain we didn't have pigs.
So no, for example, cattle or...
No cattle.
Okay.
Nothing like that.
Okay.
No.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you for the interesting presentation. I'm Christine Yung-Hong from Ghent University. And one of the challenges of insect protein compared to other alternative proteins would be the feeling of disgust among consumers. And that's something I found quite interesting, and I also don't know how we can overcome this, because by giving them information, probably they will not feel less disgusted about certain products. What do you think about that?
I think it's going to be extremely difficult. I was speaking to a friend of mine in the project, and she told me that she'd been to a tasting course. And one of the things that they did in the tasting course was they took an insect. It was not, of course, raw, but had been prepared in some way, but it was still whole. And she put it in her mouth, and she sort of was rolling it around on her tongue, and she could feel the feet and the wings. And when you have that, and I asked her, because I was kind of curious, I asked, and did you feel disgusted? And she said, no. But she's used to these things. She comes from this background. But I was thinking to myself, this kind of experience, I mean, I'm not certain that very many people, not even in here, could cope with that. So the idea that you are consuming something like that, of course, is a bit frightening. That's why I think the avenue into the feed business would possibly be, into the food business would possibly be through feed. But there again, we run into problems of prices. So unless we have to find a way of reducing the prices, or we have seen this in some other industries, like for instance in fisheries, where we have seen a lot of emphasis on fish that has been certified in some way, and certification becomes a key to the market. It doesn't necessarily affect the price, but it affects access to the market. And I think in that respect, we saw the consumer side setting the demands, and we should hope that something similar would be here. And that's why I said we have to change a little bit the value proposition and focus more on other issues than just the price.
Do you believe that for your products, if it contains like insects, it should be advertised and consumers should be warned? Or does it suffice that on your label you have contains insect proteins?
I don't know. It's one thing I have to say is when you are producing information to consumers, you have to be honest and you have to be fair. So everything that you think is going to have, I mean, you don't want to sell a product saying you shouldn't buy this, but there is a middle ground somewhere.
Thanks for the presentation. Another main driver for consumer acceptance, you were pointing at the need to trust that it is safe.
Yeah.
Have you explored whether the trust is different depending on the source of the information? Is it the experts they trust, regulators?
No, we don't. I don't think we went that far into it. No, I don't recall seeing a question on that. No, but that's a very, very good point.
Good morning. One question on the target, on the objectives. Traditional agriculture will continue.
Yeah.
There is a strong pressure to decrease meat in the average daily alimentation. So, what percentage of which food do we want to replace or add to existing practice?
We have seen this interest in reducing consumption of red meat. We have seen this interest on a more healthy diet. I think my understanding is that the acceptance of alternative proteins, if I may call it that, and this interest in these novel proteins is higher among younger people. So in a sense, I think possibly older people will be less receptive to this. So it will be, the onus will be a little bit on the younger generation to shift this forward. But what exactly, I don't think that, there are two things we have to remember. Not everyone will be having access to other proteins than traditional proteins that we still have today. There may be still expensive, but also just from geographical locations. So that's one thing we have to think about. And the other thing is that we can perhaps expect it to completely replace alternate meat proteins, for instance, throughout Europe. They will be there, but we do hope that we will be able to possibly change the, I don't know, consumption a little bit by introducing it, I suppose, all over. I don't think we should target specific pockets of consumption, but I think we need to do it more generally. I hope that answers something. But it's a fussy thing, you know. You're talking about the need to replace or complement, and you are asking where, and I say, well, that depends.
Another question? No?
I was just wondering, you know, you presented that the price is still high and that insects, as we said for algae yesterday, they are providing more than proteins.
Yeah.
But then you said we should not target niche market, otherwise we will not make the difference in the end. I really agree about that, but that's a little contradiction, you know.
It is. And I suppose the question is, you know, because if you think of this as having a big general food market and a niche market, and then you want to somehow break out of the niche market, you know, slot and into the more general market, and that can be very, very difficult. So some firms may remain in the niche for a long, long time, and possibly those that remain in the niche, they may not survive because they're not big enough to be sustainable. So that is a problem, but that's why we say if you have an increased emphasis generally on sustainability, that may enable the niche firms to go into the large market. If there is scarcity of food, quite simply, then also that could help them. So there needs to be some kind of shift in the general landscape of things in society if you want that to happen, and we have to think about how can we enable that transition.
Yeah, I agree. It's a long way.
It is a long way.
Yeah, it will not happen tomorrow.
No.
But I think that that's a good point not to target niche market. Otherwise, we will not make the difference really from the environmental point of view also.
Yeah.
And the other point is that in the end, everyone knows my opinion because we talked about that even in ProFuture. But I think we cannot ask the consumer to pay for sustainability. It's not something. It's not fair. Otherwise, we will select, you know, target people that can buy sustainable food.
Yeah.
And that's not fair.
Yeah. That is a question of equity, because if you expand on that a little bit, if you relate that to being a more healthy product than other products, then you might cause a divergence between those that have money and are of better health and those that have less money and are not as healthy. And you don't really want to go that way.